Tonight's story takes us far from the comfort of your bed, out into the darkness above our world, and into the history of one of humanity's boldest inventions, the rocket. So get comfortable, maybe pull the blanket a little tighter, and let your thoughts drift upward, the way early dreamers once stared at the stars and wondered what it would take to actually reach them. Rockets are more than just machines. They're a gamble we made as a species, the gamble that leaving Earth was even possible. And as impossible as it once seemed, those roaring pillars of fire eventually carried us to places we never thought we could reach. Before rockets, humanity was bound to the ground. We traveled far, conquered oceans, and eventually learned to fly through the skies in airplanes. But gravity was still the ultimate prison guard, holding us tightly against the Earth. The stars were objects of wonder, poetry, and myth, beautiful, unreachable, and eternal. To dream of touching them was to step outside reality. And yet, in the shadows of history, a handful of dreamers dared to think the unthinkable, that one day, machines of fire and steel could carry us beyond the air we breathe, into the nothingness of space. It sounds romantic now, but for most of history, the idea was laughable. Imagine sitting in the late 1800s, with horses still pulling carriages through city streets, and someone tells you that one day people will strap themselves to giant tubes filled with explosives and ride them straight into the sky. You'd probably smile politely and dismiss them as crazy. And yet, that's exactly what a small group of pioneers envisioned. In Russia, a quiet schoolteacher named Konstantin Tsiolkovsky sat at his desk, scribbling equations that no one else cared about. He was a man of modest means, living in relative obscurity, yet he imagined something that had never been seriously considered before, a rocket powerful enough to escape Earth's gravity. In 1903, he wrote a paper laying out the mathematics that would make it possible. His ideas sounded more like science fiction than science, but in those equations were the seeds of the future. Tsiolkovsky even dreamed of space stations and colonies in orbit, describing them decades before they became real. Most people ignored him, but in hindsight, he was laying the foundation for everything that followed. Meanwhile, across the ocean in America, a shy professor named Robert Goddard was conducting his own experiments. Goddard had been fascinated with the idea of space travel since childhood, and he worked tirelessly on liquid-fueled rockets. In 1926, he launched the world's first successful liquid-fueled rocket, a small machine that sputtered into the air and reached just 41 feet. To most, it was unimpressive. To Goddard, it was proof that rockets could work. When he publicly suggested that rockets could one day reach the moon, the press mocked him mercilessly, saying he didn't understand basic science. But Goddard wasn't wrong. He was simply far ahead of his time. In Germany, Hermann Oberth published a book in 1923 titled The Rocket into Planetary Space. It inspired a generation of young engineers and enthusiasts who formed rocket clubs, experimenting in fields with homemade designs. Among them was a young Wernher von Braun, who would later become one of the most important rocket engineers of the 20th century. Oberth's work turned scattered curiosity into a movement. For the first time, rocketry was beginning to look like a serious field, not just a fringe obsession. Of course, rockets themselves weren't entirely new. The Chinese had invented crude gunpowder rockets as far back as the 13th century. They were little more than fire arrows, unreliable weapons that whizzed through the air with more smoke than accuracy. For centuries they were used in fireworks and warfare, a spectacle more than a science. But hidden in those primitive rockets was the essential principle, propulsion. The idea that by shooting gases backward, you could push an object forward. For centuries it was just a novelty, until minds like Tsiolkovsky, Goddard, and Oberth began asking, what if we took this principle seriously? And here's the strange part, rockets are unlike almost every other machine humans had built. Boats need water to push against. Cars need roads. Airplanes need air. But rockets carry both fuel and oxidizer, which means they don't need anything external to push against. They can move in the vacuum of space. To many in the early 20th century, this sounded impossible. People thought motion required something to push against, and the idea that a rocket could accelerate in nothingness seemed absurd. But the math proved otherwise. Rockets were not only possible, they were the only way to leave Earth. Yet the leap from theory to reality was massive. Goddard's rockets often failed spectacularly, exploding into twisted heaps of metal. Rocket clubs across Europe struggled with instability and crashes. Progress was slow, expensive, and dangerous. Rockets seemed like a strange hobby for eccentrics, not a serious technology that would reshape the future. If not for a darker force pushing the world, rockets might have stayed in obscurity for decades longer. That darker force was war. The 20th century was scarred by global conflicts, and war has a way of accelerating technology. Germany, in particular, poured resources into rocket development during World War II. Von Braun and his team developed the VU-2 rocket, the first long-range ballistic missile. It was terrifying. Launched into the upper atmosphere before plummeting down at supersonic speeds, it struck cities like London with devastating force. Thousands of people were killed. The VU-2 didn't change the outcome of the war, but it proved something no one could deny: rockets worked. They could reach incredible altitudes, travel across continents, and deliver heavy payloads. For civilians, the VU-2 was a nightmare, raining down destruction without warning. For scientists and governments, it was a revelation. Rockets weren't just toys or experiments anymore. They were powerful, practical, and terrifyingly real. And once the war ended, the race was on to capture both the rockets and the minds that built them. The United States and the Soviet Union scrambled to seize German technology and recruit German engineers. Wernher von Braun, the man behind much of Germany's rocket program, was secretly moved to America, where he would later lead NASA's Saturn V project, the rocket that carried humans to the moon. This moment was the pivot point. What had once been the obsession of isolated dreamers was now the focus of world powers. Rockets weren't just machines, they were symbols of dominance, tools of war, and suddenly, potential tickets to the stars. The gamble humanity had once laughed at, leaving Earth, was becoming a reality. Still, it's important to pause here and imagine just how radical this shift was. Think of the world in the early 20th century. Cars were just beginning to spread. Airplanes were still flimsy contraptions of wood and fabric. Radios were cutting-edge technology. And in that same era, a handful of people were talking about leaving Earth altogether. To most, it was madness. And yet, within a few decades, rockets would not only break free of gravity but carry humans into orbit. That transformation is almost impossible to overstate. So why did rockets matter? Beyond the destruction of war, beyond the geopolitical race for dominance, rockets represented something much deeper. They were humanity's first serious tool for escaping the cradle of Earth. For the first time in history, the stars weren't just symbols. They were destinations. The gamble of rockets wasn't only about technology, it was about imagination. It was about refusing to accept the limits of the possible. As you drift further into tonight's story, keep in mind how improbable this all was. A Russian teacher with notebooks full of equations. An American professor ridiculed in the press. A German author inspiring young hobbyists. Fireworks in ancient China lighting up the sky. All of these threads, scattered across time and space, converged to create the rocket, the machine that conquered gravity itself. And while rockets would go on to become the defining tool of space exploration, they began as fragile, sputtering prototypes that barely worked. They began with failures, with explosions, with mockery. But out of those failures came persistence, and out of persistence came the machines that would carry us beyond Earth. This is where our story begins tonight, with the improbable birth of the rocket. A machine of fire, forged by dreamers, tested by war, and destined to carry humanity into the unknown. The end of World War II marked a strange turning point for rockets. For years they had been the stuff of fringe science, then weapons of terror, and suddenly, they were objects of desire for the two most powerful nations on Earth. the United States and the Soviet Union, once allies against Nazi Germany, were now rivals locked in a new kind of battle, one not just for territory or ideology, but for technological supremacy. Rockets, once laughed off as fantasies, had become the key to the future. Both sides knew it. In the chaos of post-war Europe, teams of scientists, blueprints, and even pieces of dismantled V-2 rockets were gathered up like treasure. Operation Paperclip, the American effort to capture German scientists, brought hundreds of engineers to the US, including Wernher von Braun and much of his team. The Soviets weren't far behind, seizing rocket facilities and bringing back their own experts. But in truth, no one knew exactly how far rockets could take them. In the late 1940s, the US and Soviet Union began cautiously testing the VR-2 models they'd inherited. These rockets still exploded frequently, often in spectacular fireballs that left nothing but smoking craters. They were massive, unwieldy, and dangerous, but they worked well enough to reach the edge of space. Scientists began sending instruments, animals, and eventually even tiny cameras into the upper atmosphere, capturing glimpses of Earth's curvature for the first time. Those grainy black and white photos were humanity's first real peek at our planet from near space, a vision that was both breathtaking and humbling. To put this into perspective, just 50 years earlier, the Wright brothers had made their first powered flight, lasting only 12 seconds. Now, humanity was building machines that could reach 100 kilometers above the ground. That leap, in such a short span of time, was astonishing. Yet the gamble was far from over. Rockets were still unreliable, and space was a realm of deadly unknowns. In the Soviet Union, the drive to outpace America was intense. Under the leadership of chief designer Sergei Korolev, the Soviets began developing rockets far more powerful than the captured V-2s. Korolev had been imprisoned during Stalin's purges, surviving years in labor camps before being pulled back into the scientific world. He knew the risks of failure in a system where disappointing the leadership could mean death, but he also carried a vision. Korolev wasn't content with missiles. He wanted space. By the mid-1950s, Korolev's team had built the RE-7, a rocket that dwarfed anything that had come before it. Originally designed as an intercontinental ballistic missile capable of carrying nuclear warheads, the RE-7 had another use: it was powerful enough to carry a satellite into orbit. And so, in October 1957, a small, beeping sphere called Sputnik 1 rose into the night sky, carried aloft by fire and thunder. It was the world's first artificial satellite, and its steady signal echoed around the globe like a heartbeat from space. The impact of Sputnik cannot be overstated. In an instant, the world changed. For the Soviets, it was a triumph, proof that they had leapt ahead of the Americans. For the US, it was a shock bordering on panic. If the Soviets could launch satellites, they could launch warheads across continents. Newspapers filled with fear, politicians demanded answers, and the so-called Sputnik crisis fueled a surge of investment into science, education, and space technology. But beyond the politics, Sputnik was a revelation. For the first time, humanity had placed an object into orbit. It circled the Earth again and again, visible as a moving point of light in the night sky. Ordinary people stepped out of their homes and looked up, watching a man-made star drift silently across the heavens. The age of space had begun, and it was rockets that had carried us there. The Soviets didn't stop. Only a month later, they launched Sputnik 2, this time carrying a living passenger, Laika, a small dog taken from the streets of Moscow. Laika became the first living creature to orbit Earth, a symbol of courage and sacrifice. The technology to return her safely hadn't yet been developed, and she perished in orbit. But her journey proved it was possible for life to survive in space, at least temporarily. The gamble of rockets was paying off, step by cautious step. Meanwhile, the Americans scrambled to catch up. Their first attempt to launch a satellite, Vanguard TV-3, ended in disaster when the rocket exploded on the pad in front of live cameras. The press mockingly dubbed it Flopnik. But the US pressed forward, and by January 1958, Explorer 1 successfully reached orbit. The space race was officially underway, and rockets were its beating heart. This period was a time of rapid, almost reckless progress. Engineers were learning in real time, pushing the limits of materials, fuel, and design. Rockets grew larger, more complex, and more powerful. Failures were frequent, and each explosion was a reminder of just how dangerous this gamble really was. Yet each success pushed humanity further from Earth's grip. By 1961, the Soviets stunned the world once again. On April 12, a Vostok rocket carried Yuri Gagarin into orbit, making him the first human in space. The entire mission lasted just 108 minutes, but it was enough to change history forever. Gagarin's calm smile and famous words, "Ekali," or "Let's go," captured the spirit of a new era. Rockets had now carried not just machines, not just animals, but a human being into the heavens. For the United States, this was a blow. The Soviet Union had beaten them again, and the pressure mounted. President John F. Kennedy, eager to rally the nation, made a bold declaration: America would land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. It was an audacious promise, one that seemed almost impossible at the time. But it set a clear destination for rocket technology: the moon. And here lies the fascinating paradox of rockets in this era. They were weapons of war, born in destruction, yet they became instruments of wonder, carrying humanity beyond Earth. Each side in the Cold War poured enormous resources into their programs, not out of pure scientific curiosity, but out of competition and fear. And yet, out of that rivalry came some of the greatest achievements in human history. The gamble of rockets was not only about physics and engineering. It was about politics, pride, and survival. A failed rocket could mean more than just wasted fuel. It could mean humiliation on the world stage, a sign of weakness in the nuclear age. Success, on the other hand, meant prestige, influence, and proof that one nation could outpace the other. Still, the danger was constant. Rockets in the 1950s and 60s were temperamental beasts, prone to catastrophic failure. Engineers joked grimly about rapid unscheduled disassembly, their euphemism for a rocket exploding. Lives were at stake. Cosmonauts and astronauts who climbed into those capsules knew they were riding machines that were as likely to kill them as carry them to glory. Yet they went anyway, symbols of courage in the face of impossible odds. Think for a moment about the sheer audacity of this period. In the span of less than 2 decades, humanity had gone from rockets barely able to leave the atmosphere to placing a man in orbit. This wasn't slow, careful progress, it was a sprint, fueled by competition and the looming threat of nuclear war. The gamble was enormous, but the payoff was unlike anything humanity had ever seen. And yet, rockets were still only at the beginning of their story. The early years had shown what was possible: orbit, satellites, animals, humans. But the true test lay ahead. Could rockets take us beyond Earth's immediate reach? Could they carry us not just around our planet, but across the vast gulf to another world? The dream was no longer science fiction. It was a goal, etched into policy, budgets, and national identity. The gamble that had begun with obscure scientists and wartime weapons was about to be pushed to its ultimate test. As you drift further into the story tonight, imagine the atmosphere of those years. The world divided by Cold War tensions, ordinary citizens gazing up at Sputnik with awe and fear, young children dreaming of becoming astronauts, scientists racing against time and against one another, building bigger and stronger rockets with every passing year. It was a time when humanity's future seemed to balance on pillars of fire. The road ahead would demand even greater leaps, giant rockets, untested technologies, and risks unlike any taken before. And though rockets had already conquered the edge of space, their greatest gamble was yet to come: the race to the moon. The moon, that pale and distant companion we've gazed at for thousands of years, had always carried a kind of mythic weight. Poets compared it to gods, lovers wrote sonnets under its light, and storytellers spun legends of journeys there long before such an idea could ever be practical. By the early 1960s, however, the moon was no longer just a romantic backdrop. It had become the ultimate prize in the contest of rockets and nations. When President John F. Kennedy declared in 1961 that the United States would land a man on the moon before the decade's end, it wasn't simply an inspirational speech, it was a gauntlet thrown down. The Soviets had beaten America into space, into orbit, and into sending the first human beyond Earth. Now the challenge was set: who could take the next, greatest step? The gamble would require rockets of a scale the world had never seen. For the Americans, this meant creating a machine that could do the unimaginable. Rockets until then had been powerful, yes, but limited. To carry a person to the moon and back required not just more thrust, but a rethinking of everything: fuel, structure, guidance systems, safety measures. It required a leap into an engineering frontier where mistakes weren't just costly, they could end lives and dash national pride in front of the entire world. This is where Wernher von Braun once again stepped onto history's stage. Having led the American missile program through the 1950s, von Braun was now tasked with designing a rocket big enough to carry astronauts out of Earth's orbit and toward the moon. The result would become known as the Saturn V, a rocket so immense that even today, decades later, it remains unmatched in size and raw power. Standing 363 feet tall, about the height of a 36-story building, it was less a machine than a towering monument of steel and fire. The Saturn V was a gamble in every sense. Its engines were the largest ever built, producing 7.5 million pounds of thrust at liftoff. The design called for 3 stages: the massive first stage to break free of Earth's gravity, the second to carry the payload into orbit, and the third to push the astronauts on their way to the moon. No one had ever attempted such a feat before. Each launch would cost billions of dollars in today's money, and every failure risked not only human life but the credibility of the entire Apollo program. In the Soviet Union, Sergei Korolev faced his own monumental challenges. The Soviets were not about to concede the race without a fight. Korolev and his team developed the N-1 rocket, their answer to Saturn V. Like its American counterpart, the N-1 was designed to send cosmonauts to the moon. But while the Saturn V had 5 massive engines at its base, the N-1 relied on a cluster of 30 smaller ones. The idea was bold, but it created immense complexity. Synchronizing so many engines without modern computer systems proved nearly impossible. The difference in outcomes would be stark. The Saturn V, despite some early challenges, worked. The N-1 never did. Every test flight ended in catastrophic failure, one producing the largest non-nuclear explosion in history. The Soviets, secretive as ever, kept these failures hidden from the public, but within the halls of their space program, the dream of beating America to the moon was quietly slipping away. Back in the United States, the Apollo missions unfolded step by step, each one building toward the ultimate goal. Apollo 7 tested the command module in orbit. Apollo 8 took the daring step of sending astronauts around the moon itself, the first humans to leave Earth's orbit and witness the Earth rising above the lunar horizon. Apollo 9 tested the lunar module in Earth orbit, and Apollo 10 rehearsed everything but the actual landing. Each mission was a careful progression, but behind that carefulness was immense pressure. Every rocket launch carried with it the hopes of a nation. And then came Apollo 11. On July 16, 1969, the Saturn V roared to life at Kennedy Space Center, its engines generating a thunder so powerful it rattled buildings miles away. Slowly, almost impossibly slowly at first, the massive rocket lifted from the pad, carrying Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins on their journey. Millions watched live on television, holding their breath as the gamble of rockets reached its ultimate test. For days later, the world watched as Armstrong descended the ladder of the lunar module and set foot on the moon's surface. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," he said, words that still echo across generations. The gamble had paid off. Rockets had not only conquered space, they had carried humanity to another world. It's worth pausing here to reflect on what that moment represented. For all the competition, the politics, and the staggering costs, the moon landing was a triumph not just for one nation, but for humanity itself. For the first time, we had left the cradle of Earth and set foot somewhere else. And it was only possible because of rockets, machines that began as fantasies, then as weapons, and now as the means to reach the stars. But the story didn't end with Apollo 11. The Saturn V would fly several more missions, carrying astronauts back to the moon again and again. Apollo 12 landed near the Ocean of Storms. Apollo 14, 15, 16, and 17 followed, each mission expanding our knowledge, collecting samples, and testing new technologies. Astronauts drove lunar rovers across alien landscapes, raised flags, and brought back hundreds of pounds of moon rock. Yet even as the mission succeeded, the gamble of rockets showed its fragility. Apollo 13, famously, nearly ended in tragedy when an oxygen tank exploded en route to the moon. "Houston, we've had a problem," became one of the most understated phrases in history. The astronauts barely made it home, thanks to ingenuity, luck, and the sheer resilience of both machines and humans. The world breathed a sigh of relief, but the lesson was clear: space was still dangerous, and rockets were never a sure thing. Meanwhile, the Soviet program faltered. With the repeated failures of the N-1 rocket, their dream of a lunar landing slipped away entirely. Though they achieved remarkable feats, long-duration spaceflights, space stations, even the first woman in space, the moon was lost to them. The United States had won the race, not just through engineering, but through the sheer reliability of the Saturn V. Think for a moment about what that rocket represented. Each launch consumed millions of gallons of fuel, producing forces that pushed the limits of human engineering. The vibrations alone could tear a machine apart if not perfectly managed. The computers on board were less powerful than the phones in our pockets today, yet they guided human beings safely to and from another world. The Saturn V was not just a rocket, it was a symbol of what humanity could achieve when vision, resources, and determination aligned. And yet, despite its success, the Saturn V was retired after just 13 launches. The political will faded, the costs mounted, and the gamble of rockets shifted direction. The moon had been conquered, at least symbolically. Now the challenge was to build something more sustainable, something that could be used again and again, rather than discarded in the ocean after each flight. But that's a story for later. In the grand arc of history, the race to the moon was both a pinnacle and a pivot. Rockets had proven themselves capable of carrying humans farther than anyone had dreamed possible. The gamble had paid off in glory and discovery. But in doing so, it also revealed just how fragile and costly that gamble could be. Rockets could take us to the moon, yes, but what then? For the engineers and astronauts of the 1960s, the answer was simple: keep going. Dream bigger. Mars, perhaps. Or permanent stations in orbit. The frontier was open. Yet the world is not always driven by dreams alone. Economics, politics, and shifting priorities would soon shape the next chapter of rockets and space exploration. As you drift further into the story, imagine the thunder of the Saturn V as it shook the ground, carrying human beings to the moon. Imagine the silence that followed, as astronauts stood on alien soil, looking back at Earth hanging in the black sky. Rockets had carried us farther than ever before, and for one brief shining moment, humanity truly felt like a species destined for the stars. When the last Saturn V rocket lifted Apollo 17 off the pad in December 1972, humanity's great gamble on the moon seemed, for the moment, complete. The flags were planted, the rovers parked, the rocks collected, and the footprints pressed into the lunar dust. The United States had achieved what it set out to do, and the Soviet Union had fallen short. But space doesn't sit idle for long, and rockets, once proven, are not easily abandoned. The The question facing the world in the 1970s was no longer whether we could reach the moon, but what we would do with the technology that got us there. The Saturn V was retired, not because it failed, but because it succeeded almost too well. Each one was an expendable giant, costly to build, discarded after use, and requiring a national effort to fund. It was like building a cathedral for a single service and then tearing it down. The moon missions had been the grand race, but now governments and engineers were asking, could rockets become less of a gamble, less of a spectacle, and more of a practical tool? This is where the idea of reusability entered the story. The Apollo program had shown that rockets could get us into space, but to live and work there long-term, humanity needed something that could go up, come down, and go up again without wasting billions each time. Enter the Space Shuttle. The shuttle was sold as a space truck, a kind of reusable spacecraft that would launch like a rocket but land like an airplane. It would carry satellites into orbit, ferry astronauts to space stations, and return cargo back to Earth. The idea was elegant, futuristic, and ambitious. In 1981, the shuttle Columbia lifted off on its maiden voyage, marking the beginning of a new era. For the first time, a spacecraft launched into orbit and then returned intact, gliding down onto a runway like a passenger jet. The shuttle program would go on to fly for 3 decades, carrying astronauts, satellites, telescopes, and eventually the modules of the International Space Station itself. It was, in many ways, the workhorse that turned the lofty gamble of rockets into a daily routine. Ordinary people, teachers, scientists, even tourists, would one day ride aboard. The shuttle gave the impression that spaceflight was becoming almost normal. But rockets, even when dressed up as shuttles, never lose their edge of danger. The Columbia and Challenger disasters were stark reminders of this. In 1986, the Challenger broke apart shortly after launch, killing all 7 crew members aboard, including Krista McAuliffe, who was meant to be the first teacher in space. In 2003, Columbia disintegrated during reentry, again killing its crew of 7. Both tragedies were national shocks, grounding the program for years at a time and underscoring the reality that space travel, no matter how advanced, was still one of humanity's riskiest ventures. Still, the shuttle pushed the world into a new relationship with rockets. They were no longer just for moonshots or Cold War rivalries. They became tools for building infrastructure in orbit. The Hubble Space Telescope, for example, was carried into orbit by a shuttle in 1990, and shuttle crews later repaired and upgraded it, giving humanity some of the most breathtaking images of the cosmos ever seen. Without rockets evolving into reusable systems, our window into the universe would be much smaller. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union pursued its own vision of rockets transforming into practical tools. Having lost the moon race, they turned their focus towards space stations. Salyut in the 1970s, then Mir in the 1980s and 90s, became laboratories in orbit, held aloft by a steady stream of rockets carrying supplies and cosmonauts. Unlike the Apollo program's one-and-done missions, Mir was about permanence. For years at a time, humans lived in orbit, circling the Earth every 90 minutes, relying on rockets as lifelines to survival. And as the Cold War thawed, the gamble of rockets shifted once more from a race between nations to a collaboration. The International Space Station, begun in 1998, became the ultimate symbol of this new era. Americans, Russians, Europeans, Japanese, and Canadians all contributed modules, equipment, and astronauts, ferried up piece by piece on rockets. The ISS was built not by a single launch, but by dozens, stitched together in orbit like an enormous jigsaw puzzle. Without the transformation of rockets into reliable, repeatable systems, the station would never have existed. The gamble, of course, wasn't just about rockets themselves, but about what they carried. Satellites, launched by the hundreds and then thousands, reshaped modern life in ways few people anticipated. Weather forecasting, GPS navigation, television, the internet, all of it depends on rockets carrying fragile payloads into orbit. Every launch represented a thread in the growing web of global connectivity. By the turn of the 21st century, rockets were no longer only symbols of exploration or national prestige. They had become invisible pillars of everyday life. Yet through all this, the old problem remained. Rockets were still expensive, dangerous, and wasteful. Each shuttle flight cost hundreds of millions. Each expendable rocket discarded engines and boosters worth millions into the ocean. For decades, this was accepted as the cost of space. But there was always the nagging idea that rockets could be better. This is where the private sector entered the story, reshaping the gamble of rockets into something even more daring. Companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, and Rocket Lab began to challenge the monopoly of government space agencies. Their promise? To build rockets that could not only be reused but landed back on Earth with precision. When the first Falcon 9 booster touched down vertically on a landing pad in 2015, it was as if the world had finally caught up with decades of science fiction. The gamble had paid off once again, only this time, it wasn't a government leading the charge but a private company. The spread of rockets in the modern era isn't limited to exploration or satellites. Militaries around the world continue to see them as strategic tools, from intercontinental ballistic missiles to anti-satellite weapons. Nations like China, India, and Iran have developed their own rocket programs, each adding layers of complexity to the global gamble. Space is no longer the playground of two superpowers, it is a crowded arena, where the stakes are as much about defense and dominance as discovery. But even amidst this complexity, the cultural transformation brought by rockets is impossible to miss. Children grow up watching launches streamed live online, an event as casual as checking the weather. Amateur astronomers track satellites from their backyards. Billionaires compete to send tourists on suborbital joyrides. What was once the cutting edge of national pride has become, in some ways, entertainment. And yet, behind every launch, behind every countdown, the ore remains. A tower of metal and fuel, igniting into controlled chaos, carrying fragile humans and delicate instruments into the blackness beyond Earth, it never really becomes ordinary. The transformation of rockets has also redefined humanity's sense of possibility. Talk of colonizing Mars, mining asteroids, or building giant space-based solar power arrays no longer belong solely to science fiction. These are now proposals on whiteboards in aerospace companies, test projects in desert fields, and simulations on government servers. None of this would be remotely feasible without the evolution of rockets from disposable missiles to reusable lifelines. Even as humanity looks outward, rockets keep reshaping life here on Earth. Think of disaster relief guided by satellite imagery, farmers tracking rainfall patterns from orbit, or scientists monitoring climate change through data collected by instruments lofted into space. Every bit of information carried to orbit or back again is tied to the gamble of rockets. Looking back, the story of rockets spreading across the world is a story of risk met with persistence. Nations gambled their reputations, scientists gambled their careers, astronauts gambled their lives. And every time a rocket thundered skyward, humanity gambled with it, betting that the reward, knowledge, exploration, connection, would outweigh the danger. The gamble didn't always pay off. Disasters claimed lives, failures destroyed payloads, politics shifted priorities. But over time, each failure added to the body of knowledge that made the next launch more likely to succeed. By the early 21st century, the gamble of rockets had become less about if they would work and more about what we would do with them. They had become reliable enough to be trusted with billion-dollar telescopes, priceless satellites, even civilians. The gamble had transformed from existential to aspirational. Where could we go next? What else might rockets make possible? As you drift further into this story, picture the sight of a booster descending gracefully back onto its pad, flames shooting downward as it slows, then touching down softly as if it had never left. Picture the vast International Space Station, gliding silently overhead, a product of hundreds of rocket launches and thousands of human hands. Picture the satellites circling the globe, silent sentinels shaping the way you live every day. All of it, every image, every connection, every dream of tomorrow, exists because rockets not only conquered space but kept evolving, spreading across the globe, transforming not just how we see the stars, but how we live here on Earth. By the time the 21st century rolled into its second decade, rockets were no longer the stuff of science fiction, Cold War propaganda, or rare televised spectacles. They had become background noise, quietly, steadily, reshaping the world in ways so fundamental most people barely noticed. You use GPS to find a coffee shop, stream a video from a satellite link, or watch a weather forecast that owes its accuracy to instruments floating far above Earth. All of these things work because of rockets. The gamble, once bold and uncertain, has become infrastructure. And yet, rockets still carry with them that old thrill, the knowledge that every launch is a human attempt to slip the bonds of Earth. The modern legacy of rockets begins with their normalization. In the 1960s, a launch was an event broadcast across the globe. Streets emptied as televisions flickered with grainy images of astronauts strapped into capsules atop rumbling towers of fuel. Today, launches happen weekly, sometimes daily, with cargo ships ferrying supplies to the International Space Station, new satellites joining orbital constellations, and experimental rockets testing technologies for future missions. The countdowns are live-streamed on YouTube, with chat boxes full of emojis instead of hushed, reverent silence. And yet, if you pause long enough to think about what's happening, the wonder is still there, a tower of metal and fire clawing its way into the sky. Perhaps the most profound modern shift in the story of rockets is that governments no longer hold a monopoly on them. For decades, rockets were the domain of superpowers. The United States and the Soviet Union, then later Russia, China, and Europe. But in the last 20 years, private companies have entered the game and redefined the rules. SpaceX in particular has turned the world of rocketry upside down. The image of a Falcon 9 booster returning to Earth and landing upright on a barge at sea looked almost fake the first time people saw it. Today, it's expected. If the booster tips over or fails, people are disappointed, as if forgetting that the feat itself borders on miraculous. The legacy of rockets now includes reusability as a norm, not a dream. This is what reduces cost, increases frequency, and turns the extraordinary into the practical. Reusability is the difference between the early days of tearing down a cathedral after one sermon and now flying regular shuttle buses to the edge of space. Rockets have become not just symbols of exploration, but scalable tools of industry. The gamble, once about sheer possibility, is now about economics, about how cheaply and reliably humans can hurl payloads into orbit. And that shift has unlocked ambitions that once belonged solely to dreamers. Colonizing Mars, building lunar bases, mining asteroids, ideas once relegated to the margins of science fiction now sit on whiteboards in aerospace headquarters. NASA's Artemis program is preparing to return humans to the moon with rockets larger and more powerful than Saturn V. SpaceX's Starship, still under testing, is designed to carry more cargo and more people farther than any vehicle in history. China is openly planning its own crewed lunar missions, alongside expanding its Tiangong space station. India, with its recent successful lunar lander, has stepped into the spotlight as a new major player. Rockets, once the tools of two superpowers, are now instruments of a global effort, shaping geopolitics as much as exploration. But the legacy of rockets isn't only written in terms of national pride or billionaire ambitions. It's also written in how they've quietly tethered our lives to the stars. Satellites launched by rockets orbit Earth in vast constellations, connecting billions of people. Farmers use satellite data to track rainfall and crop health. Ships cross oceans guided by GPS. Search and rescue teams locate disaster victims through satellite beacons. Even your phone, buzzing in your pocket, owes much of its functionality to infrastructure placed in orbit. In this sense, rockets have already conquered space, not as a frontier of exploration, but as an extension of Earth itself. Space has become an invisible layer of our environment, and rockets are the delivery trucks that built it. Of course, this legacy has its shadows. The proliferation of rockets means the proliferation of space debris. Every launch leaves behind fragments, discarded stages, or malfunctioning satellites. Orbit has grown crowded, cluttered, and dangerous. Scientists now track tens of thousands of pieces of debris hurtling around the planet at deadly speeds. A bolt the size of a marble can rip through a spacecraft like a bullet. This is the price of rockets becoming routine. The gamble today isn't only about whether rockets can fly, but about whether we can manage the chaos they leave behind. And there are larger gambles still. As rockets become tools of defense and offense, the risk of space militarization looms. Nations test anti-satellite weapons, blowing up old spacecraft into clouds of debris. Military satellites watch each other in orbit like rival sentries. Rockets, in this sense, have become the new cannons of geopolitics, with the battlefield expanded into space. Humanity, it seems, cannot build towers of fire without also imagining how to turn them into weapons. The legacy of rockets, then, is as much about our flaws as our brilliance. Yet even here, the dream persists. For every rocket armed with military potential, another is being designed to carry telescopes, habitats, or explorers. The James Webb Space Telescope, launched in 2021, now peers deeper into the universe than ever before, revealing galaxies born billions of years ago. Its journey to orbit was possible only because of rockets. And in those images, golden spirals of starlight stretched across cosmic distances, we see why rockets are worth the gamble. They give us perspective. They show us our place in a vast, ancient universe. The legacy of rockets is also psychological. They remind us of possibility. They are monuments of motion, physical proof that humans can imagine something absurd, like strapping themselves to controlled explosions, and make it real. Every child who watches a rocket lift off learns, in some subconscious way, that limits can be defied. The thunder of engines, the trail of fire across the sky, it's all a kind of collective reminder that we are a species that dares. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy, daring. Rockets dared to challenge gravity itself. They dared to turn imagination into hardware, math into machinery, dreams into destinations. They dared to make Earth seem less like a cage and more like a starting point. Even now, as rockets become tools of business and industry, that daring hasn't faded. It has simply evolved. The daring now lies in building a city on Mars, in returning to the moon to stay, in creating industries that span planets. The gamble has grown, but so has the vision. As you let yourself drift deeper into rest, think of the legacy we've built. A night sky filled not only with stars, but with satellites quietly circling overhead. An international space station where astronauts from once rival nations share meals and experiments. A future where rockets may one day depart daily, not just to orbit, but to other worlds. Humanity has always looked upward, but rockets gave us the means to follow through. The legacy of rockets is not finished, it is ongoing, unfolding with every launch, every countdown, every plume of smoke and fire that rises from a pad somewhere on Earth. Each rocket carries not just its payload, but centuries of ambition, rivalry, failure, and triumph. Each one whispers the same promise, that the sky is not the limit. And so, as the engines roar in your imagination, and the story of rockets stretches into tomorrow, let the thought settle with you, these machines of fire and steel have already changed everything. They have shrunk the world, expanded our reach, and planted the seeds of futures we are only beginning to imagine. Rockets did not just conquer space. They conquered impossibility.